Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and happy Valentine's Day. And now I have to justify everything that's just been said. I'll start with the proposition that across most of the world, most peoples have traditions of monsters similar to those who are called dragons in English. In other words, giant winged land reptiles of lizard or snake kind, or giant water serpents. It may be that there is a genuinely ancient, collective human memory at work here. Our ancestors in Africa long ago would have had to deal with big poisonous snakes, big constricting snakes, large birds of prey, and crocodiles. Moreover, venomous or crushing snakes are the only dangerous animal that every single inhabited continent has in common. So monsters of the sort I've just described are a compound of all those primordial natural hazards. However, two areas in the world have made such creatures especially prominent in art and story, and they're Europe and the Far East, especially China. But the nature of the dragon is very different in each. European dragons are super predators who take up residence near a human community and eat the people and their livestock. Their functional role is then to get killed by heroes. Chinese dragons look like elongated versions of European dragons with lizard bodies, 4 legs, clawed feet, and wings, and fangs. But otherwise, they have nothing in common with them. Chinese dragons are friendly and beneficial to humans if treated with respect. They don't breathe fire, and they inhabit water of all kinds. They exist in harmony with the natural magnetic energies of the earth, as reflected in the Chinese art of feng shui, or feng shui. I therefore have 2 questions to answer in this talk. Why did Europeans believe in dragons so much? And why are European dragons so nasty and Chinese dragons so nice? To go to Europe first, there are 2 main kinds of European dragon in popular folklore and medieval literature. One is the fire drake, a reptile with wings, a horned or crested head, a spined tail, and fiery breath. The fire drake is the classic dragon of medieval heraldry, chronicles, and romances, but also of J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and J.K. Rowling. The other traditional European dragon is the worm or cold drake. That is a huge snake which spits venom or breathes poisonous gas and can sometimes crush with its coils. There are, however, many other kinds of dragon that appear in European folklore, literature, and heraldry. The one that I'll mention here is the basilisk, or cockatrice. There's a thoroughly glorious but misleading description of one in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, where it takes the form of a gigantic serpent. The classic medieval basilisk was a winged snake or a scaly cockerel, only a few feet long. It was formed from an egg hatched by a toad. What J.K. Rowling got absolutely right was its most famous characteristic, that it kills with its stare. England has the largest number of dragon legends for a country its size anywhere in the world, 68 in all. Somerset, my local county, has most, followed by Yorkshire. The chief narrative function of English dragons is to get killed. And the whole point of the typical dragon story is that slaying one is difficult. There are no specialists and no kit. Dragon slaying, draconicide, is a one-off ad hoc business with no pros. English dragon slayers include 5 saints, ranging from the local to the truly international, such as Saint George. George was probably a real Roman soldier who got martyred during the great persecution of Christians under the Emperor Diocletian, but he's not actually mentioned by anybody until the 6th century, a couple of hundred years later. He's first mixed up with a dragon, however, 600 years later, in the time of the Crusades. This is almost certainly because Jaffa in Palestine, which became part of the Crusader kingdom, was both one of George's cult centers and the setting for the ancient legend of Perseus and Andromeda. Perseus rescued Andromeda from a sea monster, and his legend got built into George's, with the sea beast turned into the more familiar European monster by the Middle Ages, the dragon. And the Crusaders then brought the story home to Europe. In modern memory, the classic dragon slayer is a noble knight, and there are 24 of those in England. There are, however, also 26 stories in which the slayer is a young artisan, like a tailor or a cobbler. Now, those trades rely on skill and independence, so the majority of English dragon slayers are working-class lads made good. Both traits are needed for the job, because a dragon always has a hide too tough to be pierced by conventional weapons. One solution is to get the dragon to swallow you and then pierce it from the inside. This is clearly risky, but it's still a trick obvious enough to be found worldwide as a way for really hard heroes to kill huge monsters. The ancient gods Indra in India and Marduk in Babylon both used it. Another mode is to stab the dragon through the mouth as it opens its jaws to swallow you, also tricky. A third, which is the cowardly way, is to poison the beast. The least obvious is to put on spiked armor or get into a barrel studded with spikes. The dragon then, if it's stupid enough, charges you and impales itself on the spikes, if they're long enough. This idea actually came from watching hedgehogs deal with vipers by rolling into a spiked ball against which the striking serpent got injured or killed. Whatever the method employed, dragon slaying served 2 different purposes. One is a monster killing, which is one of the oldest and most timeless forms of human narrative. The other is a heroic howdunit, in which the good characters are pitted against much more powerful and evil foes. Good is expected to win, but until the end it seems impossible to see how it can. Just think James Bond, Star Wars, or The Lord of the Rings. It's clear there's a particular boom period in the creation of English dragon legends. This was between 1350 and 1550, when they got attached to a range of families and communities, got carved in churches, and appeared in games and processions. The reason for this is simply that the period followed the adoption of George as the English national patron saint. His legend then got spread across the country and started the huge popularity of dragon slaying as an English folk motif. But the basic point of the dragon remains that dragons are there to eat people and their livestock and then come to a sticky end in Europe. What they almost never do is guard treasure, as they do in a lot of modern fiction. This is simply because they do guard treasure in a narrow range of Germanic medieval tales, and the most famous are Beowulf and the Volsunga saga, where Beowulf and Siegfried become the dragon killers, and two Oxford dons who had to teach Beowulf and the Volsunga saga every week were J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and that's why treasure-guarding dragons are so big in modern fiction. But behind all these traditions lay much older precursors. The ancient Greek heroes killed giant snakes, which English translators of the stories called dragons. The Greeks, however, called them pythons, a term employed in the modern world for a class of real snakes, of course. The Romans used the term Draco for a mythical kind of winged snake, and this is the root of the English word dragon. These beasts do things like pulling the chariot of the sorceress Medea. There's also a distinctively Norse version of the dragon, the lindworm. This is a giant snake, like the English and Germanic worm, but after it grows to a certain size, it takes to water. There it becomes the sea serpent, or lake monster. The greatest in Norse legend was the Midgard serpent, which encircled the whole earth. Unlike dragons in general, Norse lindworms continue to be sighted right up to the present. In 1894, two of them were reported in a newspaper as blocking the entrance to the harbour of the Norse fishing village of Ervinken. The nearest one was dark yellow and 180 feet long. A whaling ship set out from the nearest big port very bravely to fight the snakes, but both sensibly vanished as it approached. Now, all this sounds amazingly real, but if it is, then Norse lindworms are scrupulously nationalist. Once you cross into Finland, they're absent, even though Finland has lots of lakes and an enormous seacoast. Finnish dragons live on hills and only eat fat people and hate eggs. So, children, if you eat up your eggs and stay slim, you are safe. In other words, a creature that on one side of the border can block a modern fishing port, on the other is equivalent to A.A. Milne's bears, who only eat children who tread on the lines between paving stones. So what were dragons? I'm going to start with some fun answers, really attractive answers, but also, I think, are wrong answers. And the first issue to settle when dealing with these is whether dragons actually existed as portrayed. Zoologists were long confident that fire drakes were physically impossible, but in 1979, a cryptozoologist called Peter Dickinson showed that they were not. He suggested that they produced hydrogen gas from hydrochloric acid in their stomachs, which was burned off through their mouths. This enabled them to descend in flight, like balloons burning off gas. And of course, the acid completely consumed their bodies after death, which is why we never find their remains. The theory is wonderful. It is also, however, incapable of proof, and it's hard to see how stomach acid could consume an entire huge body. Moreover, no dragon legend describes a fire drake imploding after death. Instead, we're often told how parts of the body were preserved as trophies. Another theory was popularized by John Michel in 1969, which imposed the Chinese view of dragons on the entire world. It picked up on the Chinese idea that dragons moved along currents of natural energy that cross the earth. John gave these currents the English name of ley lines, and declared that the Chinese belief had been held across the whole planet. He declared that also the European hostility towards dragons had been imposed by repressive medieval Christianity. This turned benevolent earth energies into satanic monsters. His book was the main force in catalyzing the whole late 20th century enthusiasm for mapping and dowsing ley lines. I acknowledge readily that this has given great pleasure and re-enchanted the landscape for many people. In dragon lore, however, John got things the wrong way round. It's the Chinese belief in benevolent dragon-like creatures which is anomalous in a world context. Most peoples have treated giant reptilian beasts as monsters, and the European antipathy towards them goes, as I've indicated, way back before Christianity. There's also a psychological explanation for dragon stories, that they are simply metaphors for predatory human beings. They're certainly used as such in history. The Romans had dragon standards, like windsocks on poles, which made a roaring sound as cavalry charged. This is incidentally the only historical detail which Jerry Bruckheimer's film about King Arthur got right. But we were treated to Keira Knightley in a leather bikini to console those looking for historical accuracy. The Vikings famously had dragon figureheads on the ships. Both groups ravaged lands and demanded tribute. The trouble here is that Romans and Vikings used the dragon as a symbol for ferocity because the concept of it already existed. It's also not obvious that dragons function well as a metaphor for armed bands of humans. They seem to be much more like animal predators. So we now come to explanations which I think to be credible but marginal. One is that dragons are the result of freak meteorology. Medieval chronicles abound in references to fiery dragons seen high in the air, and meteors and comets could account for all of these. Medieval and early modern night skies were very bright, as there was so little human lighting. Some dragons could also have been misidentified real animals. The closest real beast to dragons are crocodiles, which can grow up to 30 feet in length and weigh 3 tons. They're also highly predatory. Even today, they kill an average 5,000 people a year, more than any other species except humans. A so-called dragon exhibited at Durham in 1569 was a crocodile, and escaped crocodilians would explain some local medieval dragon legends. The dragon of St. Leonard's Forest, described in a pamphlet of 1614, the forest is in Sussex, was a giant snake which reared up when approached, killed people and dogs with its bite, ate rabbits, and vanished when winter came. Now this would fit an escaped king cobra or mamba in all those details, including not being able to survive frost. Accidents of natural history can also plausibly explain bits of dragon lore. Hens are sometimes born with insufficient estrogen and develop the physical characteristics of cocks. Sometimes the hormonal balance is rectified and they lay eggs. In pre-modern societies also, hens often suffered from roundworms, which could get from the animal into its eggs. When such an egg was cracked, the writhing worm was revealed, a newborn basilisk, which you may remember was supposed to be hatched from an egg laid by a cock. All these factors, in my opinion, do indeed credibly explain certain dragon legends, or classes of reference to dragons. There is, however, an obvious problem with them as a general source of explanation, even when they're all rolled together. That is, all the comets, meteors, crocodilians, cobras, and worm-infested eggs presuppose an existing idea. When you look up into a medieval sky and see a meteor, you don't think it's a flying, fire-breathing reptile unless you already believe in such beasts. To get to the real roots of the belief in dragons, we're going to have to dig deeper. But first, I need to do 2 bits of tidying up. The first is to suggest an origin for the most distinctive and classic form of European dragon, the fire drake. No other culture and time has produced a predatory, big reptilian monster that breathes fire. I'd suggest it comes from just one source, and that happens to be the book that medieval and early modern Europeans read, respected, and believed more than any other, the Bible. The relevant passage is in the book of Job, chapter 41, and it's spoken by God himself. This is actually very rare. Jehovah almost never speaks in the first person in the Bible, and it begins, "Hast thou seen Leviathan?" And it then goes on to say, can you draw out Leviathan with a hook, or his tongue with a cord? And it then goes on for a number of verses to portray a gigantic monster with terrible sharp teeth, scales so close together that no weapon can possibly pierce them. And out of his mouth go burning lamps, and sparks of fire leap out. Out of his nostrils goeth smoke, as out of a seething pot or cauldron. And it then goes on to say about his heart being like a stone, about how swords and spears are useless against him, and how he makes the deep boil like a pot, the deep being the sea. He makes the sea like a pot of ointment. He makes a path to shine after him. He is a king over the kingdom of pride. By the 17th century, when Christians were starting to understand the natural world better, it became generally concluded that the Leviathan is a sperm whale. This is probably correct. If a plume of water from its blowhole was mistaken for smoke, and that therefore it was concluded that an animal blowing smoke out of its head must have a fire in its mouth. To medieval readers, therefore, what you have here is a huge, scaly, fire-breathing monster with terrible teeth, apparently found in both land and sea, with a hide impervious to conventional weapons. Apart from the wings, which could be added to account for the way in which it spans environments, this is a blueprint fire drake. Leviathans are mentioned briefly elsewhere in the Old Testament, such as in Isaiah, and always with the reputation of being the most terrifying of animals, more powerful and deadly than lions. To those who regarded the Bible as the literal word of God, which is most Christians till the 19th century, something that he speaks in the first person is going to carry particular weight. No wonder the fire drake became the classic monster of the Christian world from the Anglo-Saxon times onwards. This isn't a theory of mine. It's shared widely among cryptozoologists, and I'm simply endorsing it. There's a final loose end to be tied, that dragons are now once again really big business in fantasy literature and screenplays. There have been dozens of fantasy novels with dragon or dragons in the title, published since 1970. What is striking about them is that most regard dragons as a good thing, as essentially intelligent and sensitive beasts that can be allies of humans. I am your dragon, Eragon. In particular, the 1970s threw up a new sort of hero or heroine, the dragon rider, who treats the beasts both as steeds and companions. These were the work of Anne McCaffrey, an Irish woman who moved to America and who really loved horses. And so her flying dragons are actually horses that breathe fire and look like dragons and have horse-like characteristics. What has happened is that the physical form of the classic European dragon, the fire drake, has been combined with the spiritual form of the classic Chinese dragon in a Western world that is kinder and greener and doesn't have to worry any longer about predators. This combination has taken place, logically enough, in the nation which is both the current leader of the globe and lies midway between Europe and China, America. Now it's time to discuss the most fundamental aspects of the concept of the dragon. European dragons occupy a very specific animal relationship with humanity. They're what the American eco-journalist David Quammen has named the alpha predator. Great and terrible flesh-eating beasts were part of the ecological matrix within which our species evolved. They were part of the psychological context within which we formed our identity. They were part of the spiritual systems that we developed for coping with the cosmos. Their ferocity and hunger and complete violation of our sense of self and of self-worth were grim realities that could be eluded but not forgotten. To nearly all early humanity and to traditional peoples, right up until almost the present, they were a familiar kind of capricious misfortune. Among the earliest forms of human self-awareness must have been the awareness of being prey. Even in the most modernized and well-protected modern societies, zoological melodrama, a genre described by detractors as predator porn, whether it be Jaws, Alien, Deep Blue Sea, Lake Placid, or Jurassic Park, is a well-established form of entertainment. An alpha predator, however, is not just any animal that eats humans. It's a solitary hunter which makes a one-to-one relationship with its prey. Predators that hunt in packs, like cowards, however dangerous to humans, such as hyenas, wild dogs, and wolves, do not qualify. On the other hand, a lone, big rogue wolf does, in a region which has no more frightening wildlife. Elephants kill more people every year than any other mammal, but they don't count because they don't eat their victims. They've never been made the mythological alpha predator. The very real human fear of predators means that a good lord or chief in a traditional human society is, at least in theory, in the position of a shepherd to his flock. He is there to guard its members against both human and animal foes. And the greater the hero, the more spectacular is the predator against which he is matched. The oldest surviving piece of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, has a battle between a king and a monster at the center of the story. The greatest heroes of their respective peoples, Heracles, alias Hercules, and Beowulf, were serial killers of predators. It also matters that human societies tend to have room for only one alpha predator in their imaginative space. Across most of the old world, the predator of human symbolic choice is the lion. It features as such in both Greek myth, hence Heracles, and the Bible, hence Samson. And one of the chief duties of an ancient Near Eastern king was to kill lions personally, as a sign of royal prowess and so an ability to defend his people. Lions always stood in for foreign foes when none of the latter were currently available. In ancient India and Persia and tribal Africa, to be a ruler likewise meant being a lion killer. Other predators took over only where lions didn't exist. For example, in India, outside lion country, where the tiger stood in. Across most of the rest of East Asia and Eastern Siberia, where there were tigers. And in West Africa, where the next cat down the pecking or biting order was the leopard. You can go on down the scale. In lands with no big cats, the bear is the alpha predator. And where there are no big land animals at all, the crocodile or the shark takes over. In medieval Europe, however, the alpha predator was missing. Lions disappeared from almost all of Europe at the end of the Ice Age. The European brown bear is much less dangerous than other species, and very rarely do European wolves produce the giant lone serial killer of humans that is needed to qualify as a mythological alpha predator. Lions stayed pretty close. They survived in Turkey until the 1870s and in Algeria and Morocco till the 1920s, but they were never, even by the New Stone Age, an actual menace to most Europeans. Instead, the lion's reputation as the combatant of great kings and the lordly appearance and flamboyant behavior of the male lion made it the royal beast par excellence to Europeans. In the medieval bestiaries, it stood for courage and regality. It became the most common symbol of West European rulers, especially in Britain, Spain, and Germany. The British lion still roars for us today. Europeans therefore had an imaginative need for an alpha predator that was even more powerful and terrifying than the lion, and which could be treated as an emblem of evil as well as of ferocity. The dragon filled that conceptual gap. This does, however, invite the question of why medieval Europeans would have thought that the dragon was more native to their lands than the lion, so it could be appropriated for the job, and why they thought it was so real. There is absolutely no evidence for dragon-like creatures actually surviving on land in Europe during historic times. Things get a lot trickier and more interesting, however, as soon as we hit deep water. Whereas nobody nowadays claims to see fire drakes, worms, or basilisks, lake and sea monsters are regularly reported across the world, including Britain, hence Loch Ness. Zoologically, there's still a lot of mileage in a lindworm or a sea serpent. We do have some good candidates for these among real creatures. One is the ribbon fish, which is the fish on the screen, which is a rare species of eel that often grows to more than 20 feet and has red spines running down its back, which rise to a crest on its head. In addition, the natural decomposition of carcasses can turn even well-known marine species, studied at close quarters, into fabulous beasts. In 1977, the Japanese National Museum of Natural Science identified photographs of a huge corpse trawled up by fishermen off New Zealand as showing a prehistoric plesiosaur. Only when tissues saved from the body, and it's merciful that the tissues were saved, were examined, did it turn out to be a badly rotted blue shark, whom decomposition had turned into the shape of a plesiosaur. Many reports of sea serpents are now attributed by marine biologists to sightings of the giant squid, the long tentacles of which can easily be taken for the body of a huge serpent. Giant squids can grow to more than 100 feet in length, over half of which are the tentacles. And mistaking a giant squid for a sea serpent is even easier if the squid concerned is dead and dismembered, and the tentacles appear to form one continuous creature on the surface of the sea. Having said that, however, we still face two puzzles. One is that there are simply no known animals that correspond to some of the detailed descriptions of sea and lake monsters provided by observers over the centuries. There's still a mystery here. Remember that 180-foot yellow serpent just off the harbour of Ervinken and its mate. The other is that we're still no nearer finding real animals which correspond to the European land dragons, so prominent in tradition. I'd suggest they were indeed prehistoric monsters, but safely dead. Not living fossils, just fossils. Since Homo sapiens first acquired its capacity for reasoning, humans will have noted that huge bones weather out of the rocks, often of creatures with teeth like steak knives in powerful jaws, plus grasping claws and horns. It would have been obvious to the observers that such beasts no longer lived in the lands concerned. To humans before the sciences of geology and paleontology and the concept of evolution had appeared, the obvious explanation was they'd been exterminated. Given their size and ferocity, it had to have been heroes who did it. At times, in the case of dragons, we can be much more specific. Every time that a relic of a historic dragon has actually been preserved, it turns out to be a long-extinct animal. One of the most famous European dragons was that of Klagenfurt in Austria, slain by a duke of Austria. Its skull was displayed in the town hall until the 19th century, when it was identified as that of a woolly rhinoceros. Another Austrian, the paleontologist Ottenio Abel, studied dragon legends in 1914. He realized that the cave systems, traditionally identified as the lairs of the beasts, often contained the bones of cave bears, massive Ice Age predators with sharp teeth. The head of the dragon of Kilve, Somerset, was preserved, and is that of one of the Jurassic marine reptiles called ichthyosaurs. The reason why Somerset is richer in dragon legends than any other county may simply be that its limestone rocks preserve fossil remains, especially those of ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and pliosaurs, with great clarity. And pliosaurs, just for the record, are the biggest carnivorous animals that the planet has ever produced. Truly terrifying beasts, and they look it in their skeletons. We can be a lot more sure of this now because of the work of Adrienne Meyer, a classicist who also understands paleontology, a rare combination. She points out that ancient literature is full of references to giant bones. Where skeletons are found in fossil beds superimposed on each other, it would be easy to see how these could reasonably give rise to tales of hybrid beasts, such as centaurs and the chimera. She has also pointed to two specific sources of dragon legends. One is that of the griffin, the half-lion, half-eagle beast of European legend. The ancient Greeks invented the idea of griffins, and they placed their homeland in Central Asia. Now that region is full of fossils of beaked dinosaurs, which look very much like the griffins of myth. The other is much more particular to dragons, and consists of one of the most influential sources of dragon lore, the biography of the philosopher Apollonius of Tyana, written by Philostratus in the Imperial Roman period. It included a description of a journey that Apollonius had made to northern India, in which he described huge, scaly, serpentine monsters in two main species, one smooth-headed and the other larger and crested. This account, the result of one Greek taking the hippie trail across Persia to India in the first centuries of the Common Era, became the basis of a considerable amount of medieval and early modern dragon lore. His account repeated wholesale in works on dragons right up to the 17th century. Adrian Mayer pointed out that Apollonius's route into India along the old Persian royal road would have taken him under the Siwalik Hills, which are full of bones of huge extinct crocodiles and mammals. One vivid detail in Apollonius's story has a direct parallel in the Siwalik. This is the information that one kind of Indian dragon had a jewel in the center of its skull, again a motif that passed into European dragon lore. As it happens, the rocks of the Siwalik form crystals, and these often grow inside the larger fossil skulls in the hills. Adrian Mayer picked up on other certain or probable connections between ancient myths and fossil remains. She noted that the Greek historian Herodotus had said that great flying serpents lived in the Egyptian desert. This may have been inspired by the sight of the bones of the enormous sail-backed predatory dinosaur, Spinosaurus aegypticus, which is the super nasty of Steven Spielberg's film Jurassic Park 3. More certain is the alleged discovery of the skeleton of the monster slain by Perseus to rescue Andromeda, which was dug up in imperial Roman times at the traditional setting of the tale at Joppa, the modern Jaffa, in Palestine. It was brought to Rome and had a 40-foot backbone. Clearly this was some kind of prehistoric beast. It's notable that China and Europe, lands of dragon lore par excellence, are both exceptionally rich in fossil-bearing rocks that produce big, ferocious-looking, extinct beasts. Chinese fossils have been called dragon's bones since records begin. But China didn't make the dragon the alpha predator of its myths, because it had enormous striped alpha predators on its premises already, the tigers, that ate the Chinese in large numbers until the 1930s. And so the tiger hunter became the classic hero of China's mythology and legend. And these harmless, enormous, bony beasts weathering out of the rock became associated with the energies of the earth from which they came and regarded as benevolent. It is time to conclude. I would suggest 3 stages of creation of dragon myth. The first is the general human need for stories about alpha predators and the ancestral fear of great reptilian beasts, crocodiles and snakes, from our remotest human past in the Africa from which our species came. The second is the discovery of giant fossils and the sighting of mysterious sea beasts, supplying the apparent objective evidence that these things had been and still were around. And the third is that regional traditions then form. Europe gets dragons as alpha predators because it lacks them in reality, and then the Christian fire drake out of the book of Job. China got benevolent dragons moving along energy lines. So I think I've answered my last 2 questions. And I think that if you want to go dragon hunting or communing with dragons, all you need to do is go fossil hunting. But just stay out of the water.
What an absolute tour de force. Absolutely marvellous way to spend an evening. We do have time for questions. If you've got a question, raise your hand. I've got a few on Slido. Feel free to carry on putting them on Slido. I'm going to start with one from Slido because I think it's a great question. Ronald, do you have a favourite dragon?
Yes, I'm a great West Country patriot. I've spent so many years living and working there and loving the land. And I like a humdrum local Somerset dragon the dragon of Chilcompton. And it was a dozy dragon, and the hero who went to kill it didn't actually realize it was a dragon until he'd been sitting on it for about half an hour thinking it was a log. And eventually, in some versions of the story, they felt they had to come to terms, and they did. So there's a happy ending possible to the story.
Excellent. The gentleman just said, if we wait for the microphone to get to you, then the people online can hear as well.
Thank you for that. That was amazing. I noticed at the beginning you were talking about English dragons.
Yeah.
And I noticed that Wales and Scotland were absent in that, and yet Wales is very well known for a dragon.
Yeah.
Is there any more to do with
Happy
Wales
to
and
answer
Scotland?
that. There are Scottish dragons, but many fewer than in England because of the lack of a catalysing national saint. Wales is a different matter. Wales actually has fewer local dragon legends by far than England, although there are some cute examples. My favourite's the Gwibber, which is a small dragon in Glamorgan that eats chickens and is in traditional folklore. The reason why dragons became central to Welsh identity and heraldry is because of one story which is in the British History, published in 829, in which the boy who's called Ambrosius, who is later going to become Merlin, explains the subsidence of a tower built by a tyrant because there are two dragons, white and red, fighting underneath. And the red one stands for Wales, and the white one stands for the English. And so naturally the red one's going to win eventually, but they keep fighting for the time being. And the Welsh liked that, and we all do. But the lion was the symbol used by Welsh medieval princes on their coats of arms, their banners, their heraldry. Until that splendid Welshman, Henry Tudor, killed Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth with a largely Welsh and French army and conquered England, thereby fulfilling the Welsh prophecy that a Welsh prince would do this. It actually happened, the moment they'd been waiting for since 829. But there's now a heraldic problem, because Henry's beast should be the lion, but it's already the royal beast of England. So what are the Welsh going to get? And so overnight, the Tudors decided the dragon should be the symbol of Wales because of the story in the British history. And the red dragon has been the symbol of Wales ever since. I'm a member of the Learned Society of Wales, so I have a patriotic investment in that.
The gentleman at the back.
Thank you. It was very interesting. Out of curiosity, like when we have a broader viewpoint as to beasts in general,
Yes.
let's say just specifically in this context, let's say European versus Chinese, do we know the distribution of, say, the nasty beasts versus nice beasts? And do they overlap? Are they similar? Are they very different across European and Chinese landscape?
Most human societies have nasty beasts in mythology. And that's because most human societies have had nasty beasts in reality. So it's a transposition very easy to make. But there are also good beasts in the mythology of most nations. The affection given to the raven by the Northwestern Pacific peoples, or the coyote by the peoples of the American Southwest, the reverence for the bear all the way across the circumpolar region from the Sami lands, the Laplands, right through to the northernmost isle of Japan is again an example of this. So there's a tendency among humans to regard animals as in a constant relationship with us, which they were and are, and to pick out friends and foes among them. They then get frozen in mythology for all time.
There was a gentleman at the back was first.
Thank you. I'm just curious if any other country pursues its myths in the way that we pursue Loch Ness, and are people going around actual with scientific processes trying to discover a myth?
Yeah, there are lake monsters all over the globe. Notable examples in the North American continent, and there's a favourite lake monster in the Congo, which was Zaire, now the Democratic Republic. Sometimes it's possible to identify sources for these. In the case of the Congolese lake monster, which got a lot of attention from scholars in the 80s and 90s, it was realized that it's actually the now almost extinct northern white rhinoceros, which had lived in the land and become extinct. And in mythology, it had got transferred to water to explain why you no longer saw it. So it must come out of the lake and go back in at a particular lake. And there at least we can pin down the origins of a lake monster legend. But they're found all over the globe, including Polynesia, like New Zealand, and every inhabited continent.
Let's do a couple more questions. We've got one here, followed by one here, and then I'll take some more from Slido, so people online don't feel left out.
I've left plenty of
Hi.
time.
Are there any differences in the personalities of different coloured dragons, like red versus green versus black?
Not really. Dragons are lots of different colours. That's a point on which the imagination of the individual storyteller is given free rein. There's nothing canonical about dragons' colours. And there are no moral qualities, no local loyalties attached to them, except for the famous case of Wales, because of that one tale.
Just over here.
Thank you so much for this lecture. If I may, two very quick questions. One, I noticed when you were talking about basilisk that the look that kills, not very typical. And the only other one that comes to my mind is Medusa.
Yes.
Where does the look that kills come from? It's obvious for the jaws and the teeth and the claws, but where does the look that kills come from?
The answer is we haven't the faintest idea. Somebody thought it up. I mean, there's actually much crazier stuff about the basilisk than I had time to describe in the lecture. For example, not only were medieval people convinced that it existed and came out of this egg laid by a cock, hatched by a toad, but that the only animal which it really feared was the weasel, which is why there's a weasel in the picture that I flashed up there, with a basilisk looking distinctly wary. And nobody knows why weasels should be picked, but it became canonical. Everybody knew that if you kept a weasel around, you'd be safe from a basilisk. So there is an absolutely glorious cultural fertility in all this, which sometimes borders on the absolutely crazy, and is therefore all the more wonderful.
So if you will allow me that second question,
Yeah.
I think it kind of ties nicely into what you just said. Do you notice any differences in dragon myths across the European tribes, tribal lines?
No,
like Slavic
absolutely.
versus Germanic versus...
No, it's amazingly standard. Every European people, by the beginning of history, had picked up on the idea of dragon-like creatures and embedded them in their mythology. And we were kind of baffled as to why this should be, which is why this is actually one of my ideas, I can take credit for it, good or bad, is the idea of the absence of an alpha predator in historic Europe and late prehistory. You really have to go back as far as the Paleolithic, the Ice Age, before you live in a world which has credible alpha predators of the kind found pretty well everywhere else.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's take a couple from Slido, which I've been sadly neglecting. A couple of people have asked similar questions about how did the City of London end up with dragons as its crest?
That I don't actually know. I've never found a book that could tell me, although I'm certain there must be one. Certainly, the incredible popularity of dragon legends in the late Middle Ages, we're talking 1350 to 1500, produces dragons across the landscape. They appear everywhere. And that's when they appear as a symbol of London. So perhaps the corny explanation, which may actually be right, is that at a time when the country was going dragon mad, London had to have one too. or perhaps one in every post leading in. And of course, the locals here were just outside Gresham, just opposite the City of York pub.
Everywhere needs a dragon. A couple of people have asked questions about how sort of popular imagination kicks on a dragon, sort of the combination of whether it's artists, creative people, or just people in the pub exaggerating. What's the role of culture in creating what we've ended up with?
The role of culture in creating everything else we end up with, which is that we have this stock of primeval loves and fears that focus on certain symbolic shapes and forms and traditions. And then this gets reworked millennium after millennium and century after century and adapted to modern needs, which is why in Hollywood, within about 10 years, dragons turned from being things that even in Walt Disney had to be killed to being things whom you love, feed, domesticate, and ride around the sky.
There's a question here at the front. If you the microphone.
You're going to get you on mic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for another brilliant and very interesting lecture. What just came to my mind, the dragon may be seen as the wild nature force, and in China they have feng shui or feng shui, so they learn to live with the nature forces. They build their buildings so the nature spirits aren't disturbed, so they build buildings so the dragon can go from the mountains to the lake and drink also. And maybe Europeans, especially in the Middle Ages, have seen nature as a forces that have to be overcome because they are threatening. Just my idea, I just don't know. So, question.
I don't think that the Chinese traditional relationship with nature was that different from the European, because the same Chinese who are celebrating dragons as wonderful forces of the earth are exterminating tigers as fast as they can, and usually not very successfully until the 19th, 20th century, as mortal predator enemies. And in the same way in Europe, you can have the ancient Greeks and Romans having dracos and pythons as symbols of the terror of nature, and Heracles bumping off the Nemean lion and other natural monsters, but venerating rocks, trees and water as the home of nymphs and of rather beautiful spirits. So the human relationship with nature is very complex and deeply ambivalent right across the globe, but the globe. But the fun thing here is it manifests in such different ways that it provides something really creative, fascinating, and it's wonderful seeing the different way the kaleidoscope repatterns itself in culture after culture.
I'm afraid I have to break the news that we're out of time. Ladies and gentlemen, we have had an absolute tour de force, as I said earlier. We have been informed, we've been entertained, and we have had a series of important life lessons about how to kill a dragon and the importance of retaining a weasel at all times. Would you please join me in thanking the Gresham College Professor of Divinity, Professor Ronald Hutton.